What's amazing is the value that these power plants provide to the grid and to the local utilities distribution lines, because obviously the grid runs the transmission lines, the local utilities run the distribution lines. So we're providing a benefit to both the grid and the utilities, and we get compensated for that. That compensation pays for us to install those solar storage units along with the solar into the people's homes. So the solar provides their power, the storage provides them backup power, so they don't, it's the avoided cost of a generator. The storage provides them the backup power. The grid gets the benefit of access to that power when the homeowner doesn't need it. The homeowner doesn't need the power in the battery when the grid's working. It's when the grid's not working. So when the grid's working, we use the power in the battery to interact with the grid, discharge and charge to help stabilize it. When the grid goes down, we provide that backup power to the residents. So it benefits all of the stakeholders within that community.
The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, the solar industry is on fire and growing by leaps and bounds. SEIA just issued a report that 43% of new electricity generation in the U.S. was pure solar energy. Today on the Solar Podcast, we have a special guest today, Jim Spano, managing partner at Spano Partners Holdings. Welcome back to the show, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Really looking forward to looking into the crystal ball a little bit with 2021 and beyond. As I mentioned in the opening, SEIA has just issued their new report, which demonstrates that 2020 was a record year for the solar industry in the U.S. We installed over 20 gigawatts, which was a new high. And by 2030, that number is going to be 50 gigawatts. So we're going to quadruple the industry in the next 10 years. And we're going to dive into some of those insights with you, as well as touching base on what's going on in your world. Why don't we start there, Jim, since you're such an established figure in the Atlantic Coast region? What is going on in New Jersey and the Atlantic Coast with solar?
Exciting times, Tim. I think that there's some interesting developments in the Northeast. There seems to be a lot of drive towards a more regional approach to development and climate control. So I think that what we're seeing is we're seeing the northeastern states start to work a little bit better together and to look at reduction of greenhouse gases on more of a regional basis. New Jersey, by way of example, is now considering a move that unfortunately would be devastating to the New Jersey solar market, but apparently it would be very beneficial to from a regional perspective. The concept being that solar credits that are generated from these systems, typically each state restricts the use, the application of those credits to in-state generation. Pennsylvania, for example, just recently rolled back their multi-state approach to meeting their RPS. In Pennsylvania, for years, the vast majority of the Pennsylvania Class 1 RECs were absorbed in projects down south in the Carolinas. Many of the Carolina projects were accessing the Pennsylvania SREC market in order to monetize projects and have them pencil out down in South Carolina. And they didn't pencil in Pennsylvania because of the higher cost to develop in land costs and labor costs and so forth in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania just reversed that and took a more local approach, and yet New Jersey is doing the complete opposite. New Jersey is now considering opening up their SREC market to out-of-state generation in an effort to accelerate meeting the RPS at a lower cost. of course, we all recognize that when you, as Pennsylvania did, when you allow out-of-state credits to meet your RPS, what you're doing is you're turning the jobs to out of state. You're cleaning the environment on a regional basis, but certainly not on a local basis. And then, of course, you're lowering the cost by having more projects generating SRECs, increasing the supply. Of course, with an increased supply, the value of the SRECs will go down, unless there's an increase in demand, which isn't the case. So I think what we're finding is that a regional approach is probably a smart idea, but we have to be real careful about the impact it has on the local economy and jobs and health impact on a local basis. Yeah. Obviously, having I'm sorry, Tim, you.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, because that's a lot to chew on right there. Most people think of RECs as being a local phenomenon. Here in Illinois, we have a REC-driven, renewable energy credit-driven solar market. One REC is 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated by a DG facility. That includes solar, wind, and sometimes other sources. But there's also this national market known as the Pennsylvania market, which is more of an open market where you can trade RECs. Explain that for our listeners.
Sure. When you have a local market, all the generation, the projects that are generating the solar renewable energy credits have to be applied towards that local RPS. So, for example, the state of Pennsylvania has an RPS of 100 megawatt. All 100 megawatt would have to be 100 megawatt hours. All 100 megawatt hours would have to be generated in state in order to qualify to be transacted within the SREC market in Pennsylvania. So clearly, if you have out-of-state generation, the impact is that the money that's paying for the Pennsylvania residents are paying for those incentives that are now being sent down to Carolinas, in that example that I gave, that were being sent down to Carolinas, so that the economic impact benefited the economy in North Carolina. The benefit of the clean air that we're claiming to be a clean energy and have an RPS that says we're going to have a clean energy economy, and yet we're still polluting the air and just buying credits from out of state and sending our money out of state to buy their credits so that we can claim to be a clean economy. I think it's the same fallacy that is used in carbon credits. If we really want a clean economy, we can't buy ourselves out of the dirty pollution that we're creating. We have to clean up the manner in which our electricity is generated. It's inappropriate and it doesn't help anybody to allow an out-of-state generator to generate credits so that you can claim that you have a green economy, when the reality is that you still have the same coal plants or dirty fossil fuel plants that you had.
Yeah, but so this is not a new thing that Pennsylvania has had a quote unquote regional or open market though, right? And that's a double edge, because maybe you are in a state where there's very low value or no value RECs, and you can get some value for your RECs. So there's some incentive to build a DG facility. I'm working on a project in Ohio right now where there's no state incentives, and it sure would be nice to be able to get Pennsylvania RECs.
Well, the fact is that is correct, and what we should be doing is speaking to our legislators and our commissioners at our utility commissions and helping them to understand that if you really want to claim to have a clean economy, you have to have policies and regulations in state and a program in state that supports it. Look what happened to Pennsylvania. Because they had that open market, they had very little new generation in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania market crashed. People ran for the hills. Now they're looking to change it. But for years, Pennsylvania residents paid for out-of-state generators to clean the environment down in other states. Their residents pay for it, and they don't get any of the benefit of the clean air, nor do they get the jobs that are created from that financial incentives. So I think you're right that there should be, that there needs to be programs within each state to enable the residents of those states to have the benefit, both economic and health, of the programs they put in place to promote clean energy.
Yeah. And then you mentioned a new phenomenon in New Jersey, which is considering regionalizing its approach. I mean, let's face it, New Jersey is one of the hottest markets in the country, Jim. That's your backyard, and you are in the process of transitioning, right? There's what's called a transitional rec. Maybe those are all used up. I don't know. What's going on with New Jersey recs, because there's a whole new program that's about to launch, isn't there?
Yes, the TREC program, which was actually never expected to last this long, it was supposed to be a transitional program. The state has put a significant focus and recognized the importance of the solar industry within the state. So they put a significant emphasis on trying to develop a successor program. But there's two major challenges in doing so. And of course, one we all recognize is cost. The fact that labor costs in New Jersey are significantly higher. We have prevailing wage. If you want to build a project over 1 megawatt, which is where the large generation comes from, you have to use prevailing wage. How can I compete with somebody in South Carolina that's paying $7 an hour, $9 an hour for construction labor, and I'm paying $27 or $32 an hour? In New Jersey, for example, our land costs are significantly higher. Dirt costs more in New Jersey than it costs in South Carolina. So of course, you would expect if you have to build it cheaper in South Carolina. So in order to lower the costs for New Jersey's program, in order to achieve their RPS and go to 100% clean economy, to consider buying credits from out of state to meet that obligation, to me, that is the biggest cheat to the New Jersey citizens that are paying for it. My family pays, every time I pay a utility bill, I pay for those incentives. I want my children to be breathing the clean air, getting rid of the dirty fuel plants in New Jersey and building generation that's clean in New Jersey. I don't want them building generation, not that I want them to build generation in other states, but I want those states and their economies to address their transition to a clean energy economy. I think if we want to do it on a national basis, then we have to recognize the differences in the markets, labor markets, in the permitting costs. A lawyer in New York project is going to cost a lot more to permit a New York project than a lawyer in South Carolina. I mean, so it's all those factors come into play. So you can't just look at cost is an isolated determination factor. What we have to look at is the health. The whole purpose of moving to a clean energy economy is to eliminate greenhouse gases, to ensure that we have a healthier environment. That healthier environment needs to be national, to have one area with a real healthy environment and let all the pollutants be all around it, and then claim that we're a clean energy state. That's a fallacy. It's not truthful to the citizens of that state.
Yeah. So I'm curious what your take is, though, on, let's step back for a second. In light of the new report out on 2020, that 2020 was a record year, which, it now beat the most recent record year, which was 2016. Was that strictly a policy driven phenomenon, or are there a bunch of factors that are driving the growth of the industry?
Sure. Obviously, one significant factor was the sunsetting of the ITC. That drove the same thing that happened in 2016. So that naturally drove a significant advancement of projects. People pushed projects along further in order to qualify for start of construction at an earlier date to get the higher incentive value, the higher ITC. So that's obviously one significant factor. Another factor, the Biden administration, by leading the clean energy initiative, it's given incentive to most of our investors. Most of the corporate America is now requiring clean energy requirements in order for their vendors to participate with them. Most companies have recognized the need to, corporate America has recognized the need to contribute towards the transition of the grid. Now so you can anticipate that solar growth would have grown and should grow. Now, will 2021 outpace 2020? Possibly. I have, different, here is the U.S. Energy Info Administration claims that they expect to see a 20% increase in 2020. You saw SEIA. SEIA is looking for higher increases. Our average growth over the last 10 years has been 42%. But when you're coming off a year where ITC was dropping and a lot of projects pushed forward, now what you're going to see is a lot of those projects that were looking for start of construction in 2020 will actually start construction in 2021 or 22. What we're seeing now is with the Biden administration and the new Green Deal that's being proposed, and there's a lot of strong support for a clean energy economy now. So that, of course, is going to drive a lot of growth as well. So you have some conflicting pressures within the market, but I think overall, I think we will see growth in the industry. I don't think we'll see the average 42% growth in 2021, but I do think that we'll see a 15 to 20% growth. And I think that going back to my earlier theme, look where the growth comes from. That we can't just look at the growth and say we're doing a great job. We've increased we have to look, where's the growth coming from? If the growth is only coming from a couple of smaller markets across the country, we're not doing our job. We need to see that kind of growth on a statewide basis, not on a regional, not on a national basis. You have states like California, New Jersey. I mean, there's Massachusetts. You can go. There's a handful of states that have contributed to the vast majority of this growth. We need to get a more concerted effort on a national basis, and I think, having people like Jennifer Granholm and Jigar Shah now leading this transition for the Biden administration, I think we're going to get to see some real improvement and some real good policy that will promote the transition to a clean energy economy.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the step down of the ITC. That's the investment tax credit, which was 26%. It was scheduled to step down to 22% in 2021, but then it was extended in October or November of 2020 for three years. So it's now going to stay at 26% through 2023. As Jigar Shah likes to say, that means effectively through 2025 because of safe harboring rules. So we have some more runway on a 26% ITC that could get bumped up back to 30% where it was for many years.
Our bills paid Congress to do that. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And so that does kind of show the power of federal legislation. The ITC is a very generous incentive, and it applies to solar and storage. And we're gonna talk about storage here in just a second. When you pair the storage with a solar project, there is no specific solar storage only incentive just yet. I'm sure that will happen under the Biden administration as well. We also see additional legislation to promote electrification of transportation with a tax credit for consumers. The Biden administration is talking about building 500,000 EV chargers nationally, which as an EV owner, that is my greatest concern. Now that I know what it's like to have range anxiety, I realize that we need many, many more level 3. These are fast chargers, 150 kW to 250 kW chargers where you can charge, over 100 miles in 15 minutes so you can get on your way. So it's a both and, right, Jim? We need good regional and local markets. We need good federal leadership, and uh, I'm just so stoked to see Jennifer Granholm and Jigar Shah now at the helm in the Biden administration at the DOE. Jigar, of course, is now the executive director of the loan program, which is so important. And it's not just about startups. People think about these loan programs as for very small companies. Tesla themselves are the greatest success story so far of that program, probably in the recent past. But and it'll be across the board, from transportation to renewable energy, green hydrogen. We need long-term storage, et cetera. So I sense that you're a little frustrated, though, about this regionalization that New Jersey is considering, and you say that it'll be bad, quote unquote, for the state of New Jersey. Can't New Jersey afford that, though? Because it is such a hot market. I'm just curious.
Oh, yeah, New Jersey can certainly afford it. The issue that I take is, if, as a New Jersey resident, I want to pay to clean up the atmosphere locally, and I want the people in New York to pay to clean up their atmosphere. I want us all to pay to clean up our atmosphere. Clearly, states like New York that are heavily populated also have heavier pollution, more more fuel, fossil fuel transportation, more electrification generated by dirty fuels. I'd like to see policies, and perhaps with the current administration, we might start to see some movement in this direction. I'd like to see states being required to contribute towards the overall greenhouse reduction by allowing one or two or three or four states to drive, which was great to start the process, to demonstrate that, yes, we can have a green energy economy. And yes, if every single state was to move to a distributed energy resource where we had local generation of clean energy paired with storage, you'd have a national grid that wouldn't need as much storage as people currently presume, because you can move power from areas to areas. When you have a fully integrated distributed energy resource management system in place, it's the equivalent of what we've done in the telecom industry. Initially, we had a bunch of wires that connected us across the country, and it'd take forever and expensive to put that infrastructure in place. And then once it's in place, it's a heavy burden to maintain. Now we have cell systems, we have Wi-Fi's, we have little towers that are placed everywhere, and they enable us to move our communications globally instantly. We need the same concept to be applied towards clean energy. If we have massive distributed energy generation, but all interconnected and able to communicate and to distribute power within each other. And that's why I said all along that we still need our utilities. We need that infrastructure in order to move the power, but we need to start generating the power locally, instead of this centralized generation where you have huge power plants, as is pointed out commonly from a social justice perspective. Where do these huge power plants get built? They get built where the land is cheapest, where the labor is cheapest, and the lower income population ends up with the dirty air. And we all claim that we bought credits, and now they can claim that they have clean air, but in the meantime, everybody's getting. So no, that's my issue. I think we need every state to have a strong renewable energy program that promotes a national distribution network.
Yeah. So let's dive into this concept of a distributed grid. What is essential for that is storage, right? We need lithium ion batteries and other longer term storage. Lithium is great for 2 to 4 hour storage. And we're talking now in March of 2021. We recently had a major debacle with ERCOT and the Texas grid, which not only was a natural disaster and a disaster for the residents of Texas and the business owners of Texas, it was an economic disaster for the utilities in Texas and for consumers, where consumers are now being hit with bills in excess of $10,000 for electricity, um, on the wings of having had no power for several days or sometimes a week. So that obviously demonstrates that our grid is way too fragile and vulnerable to this simple thing called Arctic air that comes down from Canada once in a while, and it it's devastating. So you have a partnership with Sonnen, which is a battery company from Europe that makes, I think, primarily residential scale batteries. But talk about where you see solar and storage going and what is the play there.
Sure. First, we have to understand that for a intermittent generation system, which wind, sun, water, water flows, sun shines, wind blows, we have power. If they stop, we don't have power. Obviously, in order to have power security, we need to have a base load source, which is what we currently use coal plants for. In the past, we had coal plants, and then we had peaker plants. The peaker plants would pop in when they had spikes of power, be very expensive. Now, I want to address what happened in Texas, because before I get into the answering your question, I want to make sure that the audience understands that what happened in Texas wasn't a failure of renewable energy at all. That's a complete misnomer. What happened in Texas was a failure of planning. Do you notice the gas lines, the wind turbines, they didn't freeze in North Dakota. They didn't freeze in Canada. They didn't freeze in Maine. They froze in Texas. Why? I'll tell you why. Risk assessment managers determine the cost to winterize those systems relative to the risk of an event actually occurring was a risk that a cost they deemed unnecessary. Had they spent that extra penny or penny and a half in order to winterize those systems, we wouldn't have had that outage. The cost to consumers, both corporate and residential, that's being borne is basically passing on profits that were taken from the developers of these projects and the owners of those projects that saved that penny or penny and a half. And now it's being paid for by consumers. Now, one might argue that had they not saved that penny or penny and a half, they may not have been able to build those systems competitively. Well, I would have much rather have seen the incentive come for that penny or penny and a half than to deal with what's happening in Texas today. You have bankruptcies. They just started. The very first bankruptcy, I believe, was just announced yesterday. And we expect to see a load of them. Now, you have to understand that when you have a spike in power like that, when all the power, all the generation ends, you could go from a 2 cent a kilowatt hour to a $10,000 a kilowatt hour charge. I mean, it's massive. Now, what companies are now recognizing is that they should have had some storage where they could have stored excess power and then reached into it when those went down during the highest spikes. Now, understand that when there's less generation and there's high demand, that's what drives the pricing. And unfortunately, many consumers had fixed price contracts for their retail energy. Many commercial did too. In that instance, it's the suppliers that go bankrupt because they agreed to sell you power at 4 cents a kilowatt hour and they're paying $6,000 a kilowatt hour. They go bankrupt. On the other hand, there's a lot of retailers that had their pricing was flexible. It's based off the wholesale price. Those retail customers and commercial customers that had those type of contracts, that excess cost from that 4 cents to that $6,000 was passed to them. And that's why you saw customers having $10,000 bills in a residence. So understand that the business models, the policies, and the insurance risk lender due diligence division, all of that failed us. That's what happened in Texas. And it's known now that what happened, and it's clearly there'll never be another generation system built in Texas that's not winterized. We're in the middle of climate change. We're doing all of this activity and transition of the grid is to address climate change. And yet, knowing that we have climate change issues, we're building systems without addressing climate change. It's kind of a silly, unfortunate lack of foresight that resulted in this debacle.
Yeah, we're kind of like ants, Jim. You know, the ones that build their homes in the cracks in the sidewalks, and then people come and walk on it and it gets washed away, and they just build right back right there. And so we have to change, we have to evolve, and we have to accommodate the new world that we live in. So let's talk about some of the nitty gritties with solar and storage, though. What is the benefit to residents and commercial owners and potentially whole neighborhoods, right? If you get a large install base of batteries, of course, that is going to provide a tremendous amount of resiliency in the event of an outage. And you people listening who aren't familiar with storage can think of batteries as a shock absorber. They can absorb extra energy that's available either from distributed generation, wind and solar, or the grid. And then they can discharge that energy on demand when the grid needs cheap or power, period. If the grid isn't operating, then the batteries are there to provide resiliency in the case of a grid outage. So how do you see us learning and changing from the Texas debacle?
Sure. Well, the first thing that I'm participating in is a significant effort in Texas to decentralize generation, to pair generation and storage, to provide virtual power plants. What I mean by a virtual power plant, that's when you aggregate a number of different generation systems, combining them or pairing them with a storage system so that there's excess power, and then combining them all so that when the grid has a sudden surge of demand, everybody comes home, turns on their air conditioners, that instead of having to turn a peaker plant on, which is the 70% plus of the carbon from electrical generation comes from peaker plants. So rather than having to turn these peaker plants on, we can start to draw power off of a combination of batteries that are in all these different generation systems. By way of example, my company, my-RESI, what we've done is we've partnered with Sonnen, and we're building across the country in several states, large aggregated residential virtual power plants. So we'll put a solar and a storage system in each individual residence, or we'll put a centralized storage system in perhaps on canopies in a multifamily complex. We provide the power for the home or the multifamily complex, and then we put a storage unit in each of the individual residences. That storage acts from a consumer's perspective, the resident, that storage provides the resident with a power base so that when the grid does go out, they can access power from those batteries and maintain power security. When the sun comes up again, the batteries recharge. The batteries provide power to the house, and then recharge. The excess power is put back into the reserve of the battery and available for the evening or for the following day, should it be a cloudy day, for example. So what we're able to do is provide power security to the consumer, but even more so, we help every consumer that is an electric user, every ratepayer, because we drive down the cost of the wholesale market by reducing peaks and shaving peaks on a network basis, as opposed to bringing a battery into a individual company and lowering their demand charges. We're able to, from a grid perspective, when the grid is stressed, we're able to discharge power into that grid instantly, and help them to manage the stability of the grid and the frequency. So there's a tremendous benefit to everybody, not just the homeowner, when you put solar and storage and aggregate it into virtual power plants. What's amazing is the value that these power plants provide to the grid and to the local utilities distribution lines, because obviously the grid runs the transmission lines, the local utilities run the distribution lines. So we're providing a benefit to both the grid and the utilities, and we get compensated for that. That compensation pays for us to install those solar storage units along with the solar into the people's homes. So the solar provides their power, the storage provides them backup power, so it's the avoided cost of a generator. The storage provides them the backup power. The grid gets the benefit of access to that power when the homeowner doesn't need it. The homeowner doesn't need the power in the battery when the grid's working. It's when the grid's not working. So when the grid's working, we use the power in the battery to interact with the grid, discharge and charge to help stabilize it. When the grid goes down, we provide that backup power to the residents. So it benefits all of the stakeholders within that community. And then, of course, when 90% of the solar in the United States is worthless when you need it most. That's what we learned during the storms, Sandy storms and Katrinas and all the major storms. When you need the power the most, all that power being generated on your roof goes into the ground. It gets wasted. It's called curtailment. We'd rather take that power we paid to generate it, put it in these storage systems and have it available. So it makes sense from a communal basis. It makes sense from an individual basis. And now it's really a matter of getting the policy and the regulations to support that growth. And I think we're going to see that now that you have people like Jigger out and Jennifer out in running our DOE.
Yeah, we need to make it easier to benefit from the value stack that storage provides. Here in Illinois, in PJM territory, so Illinois is divided. The northern part of the state is in PJM, the southern part is in MISO. And it's kind of apples and oranges because we can do storage pretty regularly in PJM. MISO is more challenging. So we need leadership from FERC to incentivize all of the RTOs, all of these super grid operators to get with the program and play nice with batteries for residents, for commercial operators. Because when the grid is working just fine, there are also values, as you mentioned, that the batteries are providing. They can provide frequency regulation, they can peak shave, and so the grid operator can also benefit just on a regular basis. And then when there's a catastrophe, a big storm, then you put the system in storm mode so that it fully charges up and saves its energy. So, because you're going into lockdown and you want to be able to microgrid and island from the grid. If you have solar but don't have a battery, your solar gets disconnected from the grid when the grid goes down, right? And most consumers don't realize this, but then you cannot benefit from the solar. It's not going to make things work in your home. When the grid goes down, you're going to be down just like everybody else, unless you have battery and the hardware to create a microgrid and island from the grid. Now, the major impediment, even if you're in a RTO that's friendly, so to speak, like PJM, is money, right? Because batteries are expensive. And and so how are you transcending that challenge, Jim?
Sure. What you have to do is you have to, in the early stages, which is where we're at, it's an emerging industry, the storage industry is emerging. The early stages, you have to identify where the sources of revenue are that can support the capital expense that you put into building the system, the battery system. Certain markets have I'll give a perfect example. Decongestion. Certain utilities like New Jersey, we have ACE, one of our utilities. What ACE, like 50% of our circuits are already congested in ACE, and we can't add any more solar capacity. But I'm going to kind of bring it down to a very basic level for your audience here. A power line it's sized to only carry so much power. Otherwise, it burns out, and that's when you see transmission transformers exploding on the poles and fires and all that stuff. So a line can only carry so much power. That utility has to size the power going into that line, assuming that every generation system that could put power into that line is going to put power into that line at some moment, even if it's a millisecond of the whole year. So they have to say, you can only put, if I have, from the traditional dirty fuel generators, let's say we have 60% of the line capacity being used currently. We have a couple new businesses come in. I'm at 65% of that line capacity. Then we have some solar systems come in, and now I'm at 90% of that capacity. Eventually, I hit 100%, and I can't have any more solar systems. However, when I put battery systems into a community like I'm doing and turn an entire community into one virtual power plant, I can completely decongest those lines to the utility, which is of value to the utility, and it means that they can get more customers onto that line and get more revenue for themselves. So there's a value to the utility by decongesting that line. Now, what I can do is I can decongest that by having my entire community pulled off of that grid. In other words, I can pull all of that demand off the grid and power off all my batteries for that short interim period. So that when the grid and the utility and that line can now hold more renewables, because if the line gets stressed, I can pull my renewables off the line. So now somebody else's renewables can stay on there. So as long as I can enter into agreements with the local utilities to provide them that decongestive service, they will pay me to install they'll cover part of my capital costs to install these systems. We put a project in Rocky Mountain in Utah. The utility actually owns the series of storage systems in a residential community called Soleil that was developed by Wasatch Properties. In that instance, the utility has the access to that power directly. It's not third-party owned. In my business model, I have private investment rather than ratepayers. I have private investors that own and operate these virtual power plants, and they provide that service to the grid and the utility pays for the service that they provide. That line, because I now can pull all of my demand off that line, it now can be sized to accommodate more customers. So that's how cooperating, I've always believed in public-private partnerships. Private industry is far more efficient than public. By combining the resources and the controls and the regulatory basis of government with private capital, as opposed to asking individual, like if we build a power plant, the cost of that power plant, which is a 30-year asset, is being paid by ratepayers. If I can have a third party pay to build a solar plant, and now we don't have to absorb that huge capital cost, we just pay for the power that we need, and it's a market-driven basis. Get more commercial, more private industry building more generation. It'll drive pricing down to the point where you're at the most efficient level, where in order to get additional demand, you're at the lowest possible price point. And ultimately, that's where I think we need to get. And in order to get there, We need strong policy and regulation. And that's why I'm so pleased to see people like Jennifer and Jigger now having an active role in the administration.
Yeah. And, what you're touching on to me really sounds like the smart grid, where you've got the hardware, meaning the solar and storage, wired up properly so that it can allow for much greater penetration of solar, say, on a certain grid infrastructure. Now, as far as your work with Sonnen and in Texas and in the handful of markets where you're working today, is this mostly for new construction, or are you able to retrofit these projects?
No, we're doing many retrofits. Uh, the value of, obviously, it's always less expensive to build with new construction. And we do partner with many of the national developers who are all now looking for, in fact, just to give you an example, we just did signed an agreement with Pearl Homes. Pearl Homes builds sustainable housing. They've been doing it for years. We now are putting our Sonnen storage units and solar in every one of their homes, and we're generating net zero power for them. You're going to see more and more home builders. Right now, you're seeing mostly the sustainable builders that are gravitating toward the virtual power plant business. But you're seeing companies like Lennar. Lennar just signed a deal with one of my competitors for a major virtual power plant deal. So I think you're going to see a proliferation of virtual power plants across the United States. Why? Because they're necessary in order to achieve the goals that we've established for a true clean energy economy and to get to a zero or 100% renewable energy production by 2050, which is a global goal at this point.
Yeah. So what needs to change at these higher levels, meaning the RTOs and FERC, in order to kind of unleash the market? Because right now I'm painfully aware that solar and storage is really only happening and only works in certain markets.
Absolutely.
People live everywhere, and it would be nice to provide the residents of America, no matter where they live, rural, urban, California, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, you name it, we should have access to resiliency at an affordable, reasonable price, because the technology is available. But sometimes there are lots of regulatory inhibitors to that. So what is your message to Jennifer and Jigger in the DOE, and the FERC regulators about how do we accelerate this this energy transition?
Sure. I think that Jigger knows that message very well. We've had many conversations, and we're aligned in our thinking relative to that topic. I think what the audience needs to understand is we have 100-plus-year-old institution. Our utilities and our grid have been operating the same way for 100 years. How many other businesses do you know that have been operating for 100 years? You can't even name them. We used to think, the big companies, Microsoft, IBM, they're not around 100 years. The fact is that you have entrenched thinking, you have a culture of we've always done it this way, it's worked. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. And we need to have the regulators understand that it is broke and it does need to be fixed. Our climate, there's no question any longer that our grid is having a significant impact on our climate, as well as our transportation industry, by the way. I think the transportation industry is even a worse culprit in terms of carbon emissions. I think that we're seeing the transportation industry transform much quicker than the general utility industry. Utilities are fighting this at every step. Car manufacturers have embraced the evolution revolution to EV, electrical vehicles. So I think that the problem that we face and the hardest obstacle we're going to face is the entrenched culture of the utility industry with its significant lobbying power. But I think they're going to have a hell of a hard time, and excuse my language, but I think they're going to have the hardest time they've had trying to make these arguments with some of the folks that are now in our DOE. I think the DOE is, and maybe that's the answers, and maybe the Biden administration got that right, is first we have to transform the DOE before we can actually transform the energy sector.
Yeah, so I can't argue with that, I guess. I see it as a both and. We need to transform government. We need to transform the utilities. They are there as a public service. They are, many of them hold partial monopolies or what's called regulated monopolies. Here in Northern Illinois, we have Commonwealth Edison, that's the investor-owned utility, and they are the grid operator for all of Northern Illinois. They have no competitors. Now we're a deregulated state, and you can buy your energy supply from one of 70 different companies. So that does create competition on some level. And luckily, that's in PJM, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland RTO, which is relatively storage friendly. But MISO is another story, and so we're slogging it out. We are doing solar and storage in MISO, but it's a more lengthy, drawn out process.
I might take objection to one statement, Tim. I think PJM, when we say they're solar friendly, I think they're getting there, but I think there still needs to be significant movement within not just PJM, all of the regional and national ISOs and RTOs. But I think in particular, PJM is certainly more friendly than the others, but I would not consider any of the utilities or grids friendly. They're understanding that storage interacts with the grid very differently than generation. And I think a lot of the grid operators have expressed significant concerns as to their ability to manage a system with storage assets as opposed to the traditional systems that they've been managing and have down pat after doing so for so many years. So I think, I know I experience a lot of pushback when I try and whenever we apply for a storage asset to be put into a solar system or compared to the solar system. We find that we have a long way to go yet, and that contributes to the cost of the battery storage. In fact, I would like to address that as well. As we saw how solar technology and the proliferation of RPSs and state programs resulted in a significant decline in the cost of solar, not just in equipment costs and manufacturing costs, but in permitting costs and all the soft costs, the legal engineering costs. I think we're starting to see that now as things become systemized and there's standards established. Let's face it, in the storage industry, there's very few standards. It's not like the solar industry where there's been enough of an emergence and growth to where standards have been established. Now there are standards being established. Look at all the different inverters that operate on and have to be integrated with the different systems because they all operate under different protocols. So I think that as the industry grows and the standardization occurs, it'll drive the cost down. And I think that we will get to a point where we can have a very efficient distributed energy managed grid that will be cost effective. But there will be some extra costs to get there, just like there were with solar. And let's face it, when we first built the first transmission line, somebody paid for it. When we built the first you know, national gas line. Somebody paid for it. So you're going to have infrastructure costs that are going to have to be paid for. But over the long term, it will significantly reduce costs, not just in the cost of the electricity itself, but from a societal perspective, the benefits of the economic impact of the transition, along with the savings in the healthcare system, in the real estate industry. Let's face it, we're losing shorelines. We're seeing storms that are destroying properties like we've never seen before. So I think when you look at all the ancillary benefits of a clean energy transition, it's going to pay for itself threefold. But we have to be smart about it. Trying to come across like the original New Green Deal that was proposed a couple of years ago that would have basically bankrupted the country. We have to be smart about it. Attack the biggest offenders first. Stop this nonsense about allowing pollution by buying credits. I mean, let's face it. If I'm a manufacturer and I have significant pollutants going into the air, and I can buy credits and claim to be a clean energy company, clearly I'm having the same impact I had in the past. So what is the value of saying I'm a clean, other than to be able to claim I'm a clean energy company? So I think that we need real movement in corporate America. We need to get rid of programs that promote. See, credits work during the transition, but they don't work on a long-term basis. They work to promote and encourage a behavior of the developers. But we need to have programs. Perfect example. We know a solar system is going to last 35 years. There's nobody in the industry financing them for 35 years. So we're having to absorb the capital cost of these systems in the early years, and we'll have basically free generation in the later years because we've already paid. Let's say we amortize that system in 15 years. Now we have the next 20 years of pure generation. We've already captured all of our capital expense. I think we need to have programs that treat the asset life of a solar system, not only finance it on that asset life basis, but also recognize the revenue that it can generate on its true life basis, not just what it can contract for revenue. And then I think we're going to see that these systems are more than competitive with traditional dirty fuel sources.
Excellent. Well, we have to leave the conversation there, Jim. I do want to make a couple of announcements. We bring you these interviews twice weekly at the Solar Podcast. Check out all of our content at cesnrg.com/podcast. Topics like DC lighting, how to reduce your load in the lighting industry. Trackers, we've done a whole series on different trackers, and we talked just a couple weeks ago with Mark Kingsley of Alliant Energy about a very unique tracker that has a ballasted foundation. And then the EV opportunity with Erica Myers, and cybersecurity and communications with Tom Tansey at Sunspec. So many wonderful topics. We're also bringing you a rundown of the latest solar and storage news on a weekly basis. Myself and John Weaver, who is a journalist for PV Magazine, do the Clean Power Hour every Wednesday. So check it out at cesnrg.com. Please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. I want to thank Jim Spano, the managing partner at Spano Partners Holdings, for coming on the show again. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome, Tim. I'd like to make one more announcement myself, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
A lot of us have heard about Radiant REIT, and there's been a change within Radiant REIT, and Radiant REIT has terminated its activities, but it is being reorganized as a company called Soul REIT, and we'll be back out talking to the public in the next couple of weeks. So we'll look forward to speak to all of our developer relationships and providing the finance that they need, the long-term financing that they need to develop their projects.
Excellent. Thank you for making that point. Let's grow solar and storage. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Have a great day, everybody.